If you've ever had a philosophy course, this is known as the famous mind-body problem. I think that has a simple solution too. I'm going to give it to you. And here it is. All of our conscious states, without exception, are caused by lower-level neurobiological processes in the brain, and they are realized in the brain as higher-level or system features. It's about as mysterious as the liquidity of water, right? The liquidity is not an extra juice squirted out by the H2O molecules. It's a condition that the system is in. And just as the jar full of water can go from liquid to solid, depending on the behavior of the molecules, so your brain can go from a state of being conscious to a state of being unconscious, depending on the behavior of the molecules. The famous mind-body problem is that simple. All right, but now we get into some harder questions. Let's specify the exact features of consciousness so that we can then answer those 4 objections that I made to it. Well, the first feature is it's real and irreducible. You can't get rid of it. You see, the distinction between reality and illusion is the distinction between how things consciously seem to us and how they really are. It consciously seems like I like the French arc-en-ciel. It seems like there's an arch in the sky, or it seems like the sun is setting over the mountains. It consciously seems to us, but that's not really happening. But for that distinction between how things consciously seem and how they really are, you can't make that distinction for the very existence of consciousness. Because where the very existence of consciousness is concerned, if it consciously seems to you that you are conscious, you are conscious. I mean, if a bunch of experts come to me and say, we are heavy-duty neurobiologists, and we've done a study of you, Searle, and we're convinced you are not conscious. You are a very cleverly constructed robot. I don't think, well, maybe these guys are right, you know. I don't think that for a moment, because, I mean, Descartes may have made a lot of mistakes, but he was right about this. You cannot doubt the existence of your own consciousness. Okay, that's the first feature of consciousness. It's real and irreducible. You cannot get rid of it by showing that it's an illusion in a way that you can with other standard illusions. Okay, the second feature is this one that has been such a source of trouble to us, and that is all of our conscious states have this qualitative character to them. There's something that it feels like to drink beer, which is not what it feels like to do your income tax or listen to music. And this qualitative feel automatically generates a third feature, namely conscious states are by definition subjective in the sense that they only exist as experienced by some human or animal subject, some self that experiences them. Maybe we'll be able to build a conscious machine. Since we don't know how our brains do it, we're not in a position so far to build a conscious machine. Okay, another feature of consciousness is that it comes in unified conscious fields. So I don't just have the sight of the people in front of me and the sound of my voice and the weight of my shoes against the floor, but they occur to me as part of one single great conscious field that stretches forward and backward. That is the key to understanding the enormous power of consciousness. And we have not been able to do that in a robot. The disappointment of robotics derives from the fact that we don't know how to make a conscious robot, so we don't have a machine that can do this kind of thing. Okay, the next feature of consciousness, after this marvelous unified conscious field, is that it functions causally in our behavior. I gave you a scientific demonstration by raising my hand, but how is that possible? How can it be that this thought in my brain can move material objects? Hardware, but we have this persistent confusion between objectivity and subjectivity as features of reality and objectivity and subjectivity as features of claims. And the bottom line of this part of my talk is this. You can have a completely objective science, a science where you make objectively true claims about a domain whose existence is subjective, whose existence is in the human brain consisting of subjective states of sentience or feeling or awareness. So the objection that you can't have an objective science of consciousness because it's subjective and science is objective, that's a pun. That's a bad pun on objectivity and subjectivity. You can make objective claims about a domain that is subjective in its mode of And the message I want to leave you with is consciousness has to become accepted as a genuine biological phenomena, as much subject to scientific analysis as any other phenomenon in biology, or for that matter, the rest of science. Thank you.
What is the self? Most of us share a strong intuition that our own self is an irreducible whole, that there must be some place in our brain where our perception and our sensation all get together and create thoughts and imagination and define our future. But neuroscience today is discovering that there is no single brain structure that embodies the self, and it's pointing to the fact that what is creating the sense of self is a complex mental neurological map allowing us to function as one single organism. Biology tells us that the human body is actually an ecosystem of trillions of bacteria, microbes, viruses, all with their evolutionary agenda. What is then the self, if what I call me is not one organism, but really trillions of different living entities?
That's where the difference is, and I strongly disagree with the idea that consciousness should be considered as the great product of the cerebral cortex. Only the wealth of our minds is, not the very fact that we have a self that we can refer to our own existence and that we have any sense of a person. Now, there are three levels of self to consider: the proto, the core, and the autobiographical. The first two are shared with many, many other species, and they are really coming out largely of the brainstem and whatever there is of cortex in those species. It's the autobiographical self, which some species have. I think cetaceans and primates have also an autobiographical self to a certain degree, and everybody's dogs at home have an autobiographical self to a certain degree. But the novelty is here. The autobiographical self is built on the basis of past memories and memories about the plans that we have made. It's the lived past and the anticipated future. And the autobiographical self has prompted extended memory, reasoning, imagination, creativity, and language, and out of that came the instruments of culture: religions, justice, trade, the arts, science, technology. And it is within that culture that we really can get, and this is the novelty, something that is not entirely set by our biology. It is developed in the cultures, it developed in collectives of human beings. And this is, of course, the culture where we have developed something that I like to call sociocultural regulation.
Det er interessant at anlægge et udviklingsmæssigt perspektiv på selvet. Blandt andet for at kaste lys på spørgsmålet om, hvorvidt selvet er noget statisk, noget der forbliver identisk fra fødsel til død, eller om det snarere er noget dynamisk, noget historisk, noget der er under bestandig udvikling. Tænk på spædbarnet. Er spædbarnet et selv fra fødslen af? Er selvet noget medfødt, eller er det at blive et selv tværtimod noget, der fordrer udvikling og interaktion med andre? Hvis spædbarnet er et selv fra fødslen af, ja, på hvilken måder adskiller det sig så fra det selv, som den modne, reflekterede sprogbruger har? Hvis spædbarnet ikke er et selv, ja, hvornår bliver det så et selv? Er det først, når barnet bliver i stand til at kunne bruge sprog, når det bliver i stand til at kunne betegne sig selv med ordet jeg? Er det, når det kan genkende sig selv i spejlet, eller når det kan have erindringer og fortælle historier om sig selv? Jeg har i min egen forskning fundet det frugtbart at skelne mellem forskellige aspekter eller dimensioner af selvet. Nogle af disse aspekter er medfødte, andre er nogle, der fordrer social interaktion. Og grunden til, at det er nødvendigt at foretage denne distinktion imellem forskellige dimensioner og aspekter, ja, det har netop noget at gøre med selvets kompleksitet. Vi kan ikke nøjes med et enkelt begreb om selvet. Vi har netop brug for et mangefacetteret begreb, hvoraf nogle som sagt er medfødte, andre er nogen, der kommer til igennem udviklingen. Men grundlæggende set kan man sige, at det er vigtigt for os at understrege den interaktion, der kan ske mellem filosofi og udviklingspsykologi, konkret empirisk forskning. Filosofien kan udstikke teoretiske rammer og komme med inspirerende input til den konkrete empiriske forskning. Og omvendt, så kan den konkrete forskning udfordre de filosofiske analyser, kan stille spørgsmålstegn med nogle af de begrebslige distinktioner, vi foretager. Sammen kan man komme væsentligt længere, end hvis man blot arbejder hver for sig.
Kind of critical part. What I want to do now is say that we can look at this differently if we use the framework of embodied cognitive science. And specifically what I'm thinking of here is what's sometimes called 4E cognition or 4E cognitive science, where, and I'm going to go through each of these, there's an emphasis on cognitive processes as embodied, as embedded, as extended, and then as enactive. So let me say something about those. So the idea that cognition is embodied is that it depends directly on the body as a functional whole and not just the brain. So to give you an example, in the case of visual perception, if you hold the visual stimulus fixed, it's an optic flow stimulus in this particular experiment that I'm thinking of, so the stimulus is exactly the same, but the perception of the 3D structure, perception of depth, differs according to whether you are actively moving your body in relationship to it or whether your body is being passively moved in relationship to it. So this is Mark Wexler's work. So the point here is that self-generated motor activity, motor signals, proprioceptive signals, directly contributes to the content of what you see. So that motor action is constitutive of the perception. It's not just a passive process in which you could be moving not in virtue of your own self-generated activity, but being passively carried along in relationship to the stimulus. So that's a case of what embodiment would mean in the domain of visual perception. Think of walking meditation, for example, where you have a practice that involves self-generated movement and mindfulness of movement. The movement is the content of the visual experience is in part determined by the fact of movement and the signals that are the motor and proprioceptive signals. In the study of language and thought, David McNeil's work calls attention to gesture and also music, as we just saw and heard, where gesture isn't a mere adornment or accompaniment to speaking and thinking. It's an integral component of them. So McNeil argues that gesture actually is thought and action, and if you're not able to gesture, you're not able to speak and think in certain ways. There's the movement or the approach that Larry Barsalou calls grounded cognition. The basic idea here is that instead of there being a kind of central cognitive system that's amodal for math or for language that doesn't depend on particular sensory motor or perceptual modalities, that cognitive phenomena are grounded in and emerge from a variety of bodily processes, where that means affective, perceptual, and motor processes. So this is the work on grounded cognition. So that's all by way of the idea of embodiment. Second, embedded. This term comes from the study of things like navigation, where in work by Randy Beer, the idea is that you treat the nervous system, the body, and the environment as coupled dynamical systems in which behavior is a property of the entire brain-body environment system and can't be attributed to any component in isolation. Third, extended. This, I think, is especially important in thinking about mindfulness. In work by Michael Tomasello, he argues, and here he's building on Vygotsky, among other theorists, that the apparently inward-looking mental capacities of metacognition and meta-awareness, both constituents of mindfulness under various definitions of mindfulness, that those are actually internalized forms of social cognition, and they're dependent on our being able to share intentions, that is, to have a mutual understanding of intentions that we both have, to imitate others, and to share attention, or the phenomenon of joint attention, that these cognitive capacities are required for metacognition and meta-awareness. So it's not as if you start with an internal view. You actually start with an outside view that you internalize. And mindfulness, especially versions of mindfulness that emphasize the metacognitive monitoring, would be an instance of this, something that actually is constitutively dependent on social cognition. extending that point even further, work by Merlin Donald, he argues in a number of publications, beginning with this book in 1991, that the human brain is a cultural brain in the sense that it's adapted to the environment of symbolic culture. Modern mind here means modern Homo sapiens. So the brain of the Homo sapiens is adapted to the environment of symbolic culture. It can't function properly unless it's embedded in that environment. And he talks about biological memory and external memory, say in the form of writing, or now for us with computer technologies, that constitutes an extended hybrid cognitive system. So what counts as memory is not just what's in the head, it's a feature of an extended system that's culturally embedded and culturally constituted. So this is what we meant when we used the term enactive, going back to the book with Francisco Varela and Eleanor Roche, that in being embodied, embedded, and extended, cognition enacts or brings forth a lived world of meaning and relevance rather than representing a pre-specified world.
A lot of us think of the self as just this thing that I, myself, am in a kind of isolation from everything and everybody else. But in fact, the self is something social, and what our expectations will be, what we might think of as a self-fulfilling prophecy might in fact be the product of the people around us and the environment that we are in. So the question about, where in the brain is the self, I think is not exactly the right one. I think we should say maybe the self isn't in the brain, it's more distributed in terms of our body and the environment that we find ourselves in. And those things, the brain is very important, of course, but also I think the kind of place we're in, the kind of people that surround us, our interactions with those people, these are very important things as well for understanding what the self is.
One of the things that in the course of this investigation they found, just informally talking to the Tibetan Buddhist monks, is they said, well, it's not as if we just go into the meditation state automatically. It takes some time to actually generate it. And the question was asked, well, exactly what does that feel like? How do you know that you're generating the state? And they said, well, it increases and decreases in clarity over this particular period of time. And clarity is a term that we use in our sort of native theoretical and phenomenological vocabulary to describe the felt vividness of the state. And this changes, and you sort of know that you're in the state because you're kind of tracking this increase in the clarity. And the scientist said, oh, well, could you actually report that? Could you report that on a rating scale? And they said, well, sure, we could do that. So what they did is they asked them to rate on a 1 to 9 scale increases and decreases in what they called clarity. And they found that it correlated with increases and decreases in the amplitude of the gamma activity.
Phenomena. 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 Phenomena.
Hello? Okay, just a second. It's for you.
There's another way to look at it, equally important, I think, which is to say that the self-report provides a kind of window into phenomenology. It provides phenomenological information. And without that phenomenological information, these changes in the signal would just be noise. They wouldn't particularly mean anything. So you're recovering information from the signal by making use, in a rigorous way, of the first-person perspective and the expertise that, in this case, inhabits that perspective. So that's the sense in which it's a neurophenomenology, is that the phenomenology is actually being mobilized in a rigorous way. Now, of course, there's a history of this in psychology going back to psychophysics, but I think this is interesting because the kind of skill in this case is a skill at generating and maintaining endogenously, you could say, certain kinds of mental states that's, in this case, highly trained. Now, I emphasized the word self-induce in the title. And I want to connect that to some of the discussions we were having yesterday about mental causation. And I made the point that, you know, we talk about affecting the mind via the brain, where the idea is that we perform some manipulation on the brain and we see a resulting change at the level of the mental states. But I also want to say that it goes the other way, that by changing your mental state, you change what your brain is doing. So now, when we put it that way, all of a sudden questions about dualism arise. Well, are you thinking the mind is something, you know, that's sort of hovering above the brain and the body, that's kind of intervening downwards? Like, what exactly do you mean? So what I would like to do is I would like to propose that we think about it this way. And this is to make use of a notion that comes from the philosophy of science, a certain way of thinking about causation that's called the interventionist approach. So on this way of thinking about causation, if we say that X is a cause of Y, what we mean is that intervening on X is a way of intervening on Y. We affect Y by performing a certain intervention or manipulation on X. So if we think about that in the say cognitive neuroscience context, we know that intervening on a lower level, so lower here could mean the level of a neuron or a molecular level, so lower in the sense of micro. If we intervene through transcranial magnetic stimulation or direct cortical electrical stimulation or drugs or whatever it might be, we know that those interventions have effects mentally. At the same time, though, we can say that interventions at a higher level, or we might say at a personal level rather than a subpersonal level, there's different ways we might want to put this, we know that that can bring about lower level effects. And all of our experiments in cognitive neuroscience depend on this fact, because we put someone in a scanner and say, okay, here's your instructions, this is what I want you to do. And we presume they understand the instructions. And what we might want them to do is to selectively attend to something or to generate a mental image. So all of that is the entire vocabulary and conceptual framework for expressing that is psychological. So the point would be that interventions at a psychological level can bring about neural effects. And I think this formulation allows us to say in a perfectly coherent way and without dualism that changing one's mind affects one's brain. That is to say, those kinds of changes, mental changes, provide a distinct way of psychologically intervening on neurobiological processes. And we don't need the meditation example to make this point, but it's a useful example because it's so striking in that it's not task-driven from the outside. It's endogenously wrap up then. For me, neurophenomenology is a kind of circulation among multiple things, and I'm emphasizing meditation in this case because I think it's a very interesting case, but you know, there could be other things in there as well, the kind of training that comes from dance, for example, which is very much a kind of, I mean, it's a mind-body training. So we're interested in, let's say, the phenomenology of consciousness, and one window on that is the ability to make more precise reports that comes with certain kinds of training. We want to have a neuroscience, or actually really a cognitive science window on that, so we don't want to just take that for granted. We want to investigate that phenomenon itself, and we want that to be informing our investigation of consciousness in cognitive neuroscience. First-person reports on a trial-to-trial basis in conjunction with what I would call second-person methods for explicating tacit experience. Because in the case of, say, Tibetan Buddhist meditators, we're dealing with individuals from another culture, and the vocabulary is different, the phenomenological framework is different, and they have an expertise clearly, but they might or might not be, depending on the individual, good at explicating that expertise in a way that would be important for science. So we need to work with a kind of second-person, almost clinical interviewing type of work to explicate what it is that they're doing. And then in experimental protocols where the point is not simply to research meditation as a special thing, that's in a way, at least from my perspective, not so interesting. It's more interesting to use this approach to address basic questions about cognitive functions and consciousness, questions about mind wandering or cognitive control or selective attention. And then of course, if we want to have a biobehavioral perspective on this as we do, then that's where the repertoire of modern cognitive neuroscience comes into play. And in the case of this kind of work, it's not exclusive, but what's particularly important is this large-scale distributed activity, the network activity that we look at in EEG or fMRI to try to characterize the shifting network dynamics that underpins this, because there's really lots of evidence that says that that's really, in some ways, the crucial level for investigating this. Not to say that, again, other levels, such as a molecular level, aren't as well.
If you have a metric of how to follow a disease, you're going to be able to develop therapies for the disease. Without a metric, your only metric is basically survival.
The moment something starts to change with the immune response, the proteins are what change first.
From a drop of blood, I can know how you're doing that moment in time. I can know if you have a fever, if you have an infection. So it's giving us a picture not just of the disease, but of the whole state of the body.
The idea of looking at proteins has been around for a long time. We haven't been able to do it very well.
People had a lot of trouble getting consistent results.
The off-the-shelf technology really wasn't optimized to do what we're doing now, which is look at the whole proteome. It was developed to look down deep and dirty at one protein at a time.
What applied proteomics did was treat this like a semiconductor line. We engineered an automatic process so that every time we do it, we get exactly the same result with the same input.
And that control allows us to collect data and think about data interactively, real time, dynamically.
What we can do now that's different is we can look at hundreds of thousands of markers at once.
It's incredible precision. Danny's proteomics can even tell the difference between what the weight of one neutron is in a specific protein. And you need visualization to be able to tell people what the distinction is between that range of proteins.
A lot of what applied proteomics is doing is solving that mathematical visualization problem of how do you see the pattern in those 100,000 numbers that tells you, should I give this person this drug, or how much of it should I give to them?
What is it about this data that looks to me like it's something I want to figure out? You know, these peaks look a little bit shifted, or those ones look a little bit higher than those over there. These are all working in concert together.
Once you figure out that pattern, you will be able to individualize medicine for every single person.
Instead of categorizing cancers by body part and lumps like multiple sclerosis, lumps like Alzheimer's, we can start to understand subsets in the spectrum of many diseases.
Proteins are going to be the key to understanding cancer ultimately, and I think to diagnosing it probably earlier than any other way that we can think of.
Proteomics offers the opportunity to really target some of the diseases that have been left behind. So if you put together a foundation that is targeting a disease, all of a sudden you can start to get an understanding of the metrics of the disease and hopefully get answers in months, not years.
We need to start getting samples from healthy people, sick people, people who are being treated with different treatments.
Once we identify the markers for disease, it'll go on a high-throughput, low-cost platform so it can be scaled to thousands overnight.
It's actually going to be cost-effective to reward people for making the diagnostics, because they're going to save you tens of thousands of dollars of people getting the wrong medicine.
The future of discovery, the future of healthcare in the hospital, the future of healthcare in the doctor's office is going to be, I'm getting lots of information, but I have the appropriate tools to see it, to filter it, to put it together, to get the better relationships out of it and make the better decision.
To give to clinicians some view that they don't have otherwise of somebody's health. And they say, now I can measure something and now I know something that's going to make this person healthy.
Proteomics is definitely the next frontier. We're just beginning to see the patterns and make sense of them and use them to guide treatment.
The company was formed with the goal, really, of changing the world, which is the only reason we're here. We want to do things big, and we want to really make an important impact in how we care for patients.
Once upon a time, there was a very special building filled with people who did very special things called proteomics, which did a lot of good for the world. But it seemed there were only two ways of getting things done. One from the bottom up and the other from the top down. And so the building was divided into two very distinct groups, the bottom-ups and the top-downs. In one group was Fred, a proteomics researcher who was a real bottom-up kind of guy. Fred worked on the bottom floor of the lab. He buttoned his lab coat from the bottom up. He crafted his daily to-do list from the bottom up and loved taking the elevator up to the cafeteria for lunch. With Fred, everything was bottom up. Why? Because of the high-resolution separations and the ability to immediately ID hundreds of proteins, of course. But he had to sacrifice any hopes of high throughput. Now, way up at the top of the building was another proteomics researcher named Dave. Dave was a top-down guy. He worked on the top floor of the lab. He buttoned his lab coat from the top down. He checked his to-do list top to bottom. And he loved riding the elevator down to the cafeteria for lunch. With Dave, everything was top down. Well, this was perfect since he was interested in answering more clinical questions that required larger numbers of samples. So he preferred using a method of biomarker discovery with a high-throughput, high-sensitivity approach. But alas, Dave still didn't have a good method to ID potential biomarkers. Still, both methods had their advantages and their raving fans. One day after lunch, both Fred and Dave entered the elevator and pushed their buttons at the exact same time. At that precise moment, the elevator shook a terrible shake. Fred and Dave looked at each other with fear and wonder, and that's when something totally unexpected happened. The elevator door opened on a floor completely unknown to them. Now, Fred and Dave had always heard that the building was magical, but they'd never seen anything like this before. On this floor, there was no bottom-up and top-down camps, but rather just freedom. Freedom to do both methods of research, giving them the best of both worlds.
The new biology is corralling data into meaning. The data are large numbers of observations of molecules over time and individuals, and at a hierarchy of levels. Sophisticated algorithms can reconstruct causal molecular networks that represent the physiological states associated with complex traits like disease. These networks aren't islands. They are highly interconnected in a complex system. The intricate multi-scale network of life can be visualized in this model. Each network, defining physiological states of the system, maps to a region. When one network affects another, that's shown by a directed arc. Interacting networks are often found within a single organ or tissue in the body. What happens when you look at the interactions of networks across tissues? These are shown by links inside the model. It's only become clear in the last few years that the interactions across tissues may far outnumber those within. This is a compact representation of a system-wide molecular network that underlies the physiological states of an organism. It enables higher-order predictions of how an internal or environmental perturbation will ripple through a living system.
So I'm really into the topic of serendipity, moments of unexpected relevance, moments in which you find yourself looking for something, you find something else, and what you realize is that what you found is more conducive to your needs than what you thought you were looking for. And Eric Davis says that serendipity lives in the space of juxtaposition, in the space of diversity. He says that juxtaposition is the basic formal operating space of serendipity, the space in which you're more likely to make unexpected connections between subjects, the spaces in which ideas, a rich diversity, a rich ecology of stimuli and ideas can intermingle and create these spaces of innovation in your head from just finding these unusual combinations among subject matter. And he talks about places like the city, with its density and its diversity of viewpoints, perspectives, and memes, this supermarket of memes that creates these unexpected collisions and creates that creativity. But he also talks about places like Burning Man, just this festival where juxtaposition reigns supreme, where a piano against some stark desert contrast is next to some overgrown dice, alluding to some Alice in Wonderland-esque rabbit hole, next to some crazy naked girl. And that unique juxtaposition floods you with dopamine, floods you with novelty, and just awakens this lightning bolt of meaning in the perceiver's mind. These heightened pattern recognition, that rush that we associate with creativity. So again, it's all about juxtaposition. The juxtaposition of extremes creates that basic formal operating space of serendipity.
In fact, to me, and I think, again, this is beginning to be appreciated even by the engineers, mind and cognition is fundamentally about being embodied into actions in the world. Very simple sensory motor tasks are absolutely key. I would say that one of the bases of life, one that I have been very interested in, it is its capacity to self-produce itself. That is, to come up by its own activity. And that is one of the sources of the creativity. You can trace that even to the early origin of life, because the very moment of the start of life in this notion of self-production, of autopoiesis that we introduced with Maturana some years ago, is precisely that life begins at the moment when something produces something which is not different from the process that is producing itself. It's completely closed as self-productive means, and that is a cell. A cell is something that produces a boundary, and a boundary that allows the boundary-producing reactions to exist. So it's a completely self-bootstrapping unit. And at that moment, you have the beginning of this autonomy that is proper to life.
He described the psychedelic experience as a period of increased reactivity to stimuli, both from within and from without. So you are immediately plunged into a dialogue with your own subconscious. Things start to erupt. Things start to emerge. New patterns start to be perceived. And at the same time, the world becomes like a sense-around system. You know, the fidelity, the resolution of the input signals get boosted. So all of a sudden you are overwhelmed, almost eclipsed by the signals coming in. You are like a mind in flight. You are in orbital position. You are seeing the big picture. But if you don't have navigation, if you don't pattern those signals by carefully choosing beautiful music, by carefully curating excellent ecstatic poetry, your reveries that you can read while you are tripping, you know, controlling the environment, hanging around people whose company induces feelings of well-being. By patterning those signals, you're authoring the song, the soul surfing that you're actually doing. You know, people that engage in these mystical states are known as psychonauts. They're literally soul surfers investigating psyche through first-person experience. And there's all kinds of answers that we can find within. There's all kinds of spaces that we can explore. The new space is inner space, and it's fascinating. We need to look deeper into this mystery. We need to explore these numinous realms, these archetypical realms from within. We need to go Carl Jung in our own brains using a cocktail of chemical technologies that will thrust the body-mind into liminal spaces of exploration. We need to engineer inception-like dream spaces to explore. And the technologies are not all going to be external. Some of them are going to be internal. You know, computers are drugs, but drugs are computers. This is the essence, and this is why we should be open to this stuff, because it's absolutely fascinating. So